German compatriots, men and women, esteemed National Socialists. When precisely 12 years ago, as the undisputed leader of the strongest political party, the late and much respected Reich President von Hindenburg personally entrusted me with the chancellorship, I began in a situation remarkably similar to today in terms of the prevailing world politics and complex foreign affairs. The devastating process of economic destruction and widespread annihilation, systematically initiated and relentlessly continued by the punitive Treaty of Versailles, inevitably led to the gradually permanent and deeply troubling phenomenon of almost 7 million completely unemployed individuals, 7 million significantly underemployed part-time workers, a thoroughly ruined and impoverished peasantry, a completely destroyed and utterly collapsed trade sector, and accordingly, a profoundly paralyzed and severely crippled commercial economy. The German ports had become nothing more than ship graveyards. The financial situation of the Reich threatened at any moment to lead not only to the collapse of the state, but also of the federal states and municipalities. But the truly decisive and pivotal point was this crucial aspect. Behind this profound economic and systematic destruction of Germany, there unmistakably stood the menacing specter of Asiatic Bolshevism, a threat that was then, just as it remains now, a significant and ever-present danger. And just as it is now on a large scale, in the years before the assumption of power, on a smaller scale, internally, the bourgeois world was completely incapable of mounting any effective resistance to this development. Even after the collapse of 1918, people still had not realized that an old world was passing away and a new one was coming into being, that it could not be a matter of propping up, by all means, what had proven to be rotten and decayed and thus artificially preserving it, but rather that it was necessary to put what was evidently healthy in its place. An obsolete social order had collapsed, and every attempt to maintain it was bound to be in vain. So it was no different than today on a larger scale, as the bourgeois states are likewise doomed to destruction, and only clearly oriented, ideologically solidified national communities are capable of surviving the most severe crisis Europe has faced in many centuries. We were granted only a mere 6 years of peace and tranquility since January 30th, 1933, a period that was far too brief. In these 6 years, tremendous achievements have been made, and even greater things have been planned. So much and so monumental, in fact, that it only served to arouse the envy of our democratic surroundings, who are incapable of accomplishing anything. The decisive factor was that in these 6 years, it was possible, through superhuman efforts, to restore the German people's military strength. That is to say, not to equip it primarily with material military power, but to instill it with the spiritual will to resist and assert itself. The horrific fate that is currently unfolding in the East, which is wiping out people by the tens and hundreds of thousands in villages and towns, in the countryside and in the cities, will, despite all setbacks and the harshest trials, ultimately be repelled and overcome by us through the utmost efforts. But if this is possible at all, it is only because since 1933, an inner transformation has taken place within the German people. Even today, a Germany of the Treaty of Versailles and Europe would have long since been swept away by the inner Asian flood. One hardly needs to engage with those ever-present fools who believe that a defenseless Germany, due to its powerlessness, would not have fallen victim to this Jewish international world conspiracy. That is nothing other than turning all the laws of nature upside down. When has a defenseless goose ever been spared by the fox simply because, due to its constitution, it cannot have aggressive intentions? And when will the wolf finally go hungry? Because the sheep have no means of defense. The fact that, as mentioned, there are such bourgeois sheep who truly believe this in all seriousness only proves how necessary it was to eliminate an era whose education was able to breed and maintain such phenomena and even grant them political influence. Long before National Socialism came to power, the relentless struggle against this Jewish Asiatic Bolshevism was already raging. If it did not overrun Europe as early as 1919 to 20, it was only because at that time it was still too weak and insufficiently equipped. Its attempt to eliminate Poland was not abandoned out of pity for Poland at the time, but only as a result of the lost battle before Warsaw. Its intention to destroy Hungary was not abandoned because it reconsidered, but because Bolshevik power could not be maintained militarily. The attempt to shatter Germany was also not abandoned because people no longer desired its success, but rather because they failed to eliminate the remaining natural resilience of our people. Immediately, Jewry began, but now with the systematic internal decomposition of our people. And in this, it had the best allies in those obstinate bourgeois who refused to recognize that the era of a bourgeois world has simply ended and will never return, that the epoch of unrestrained economic liberalism has outlived itself and can only lead to its own collapse, but above all, that the great tasks of our time can only be mastered through an authoritatively unified strength of the nation based on the law of equal rights for all and, consequently, first of equal duties, just as, conversely, the fulfillment of these equal duties must necessarily lead to equal rights. Thus, in the midst of a gigantic economic, social, and cultural reconstruction effort, National Socialism has above all provided the German people with the kind of education and training that could be transformed into military values in the first place. The remarkable resilience of our great nation has grown so immensely and significantly since January of 1933 that it can no longer be accurately compared to earlier, more challenging times. But the maintenance of this inner resilience is at the same time the surest guarantee of ultimate victory. If Europe today is indeed gripped by a serious and profound illness, then the affected states will either courageously overcome it by mustering all their collective strength and utmost resilience, or they will tragically perish from it. However, even the individual who fully recovers and thus truly survives this profound ordeal only overcomes the severe peak of such a debilitating illness through a critical crisis that also significantly weakens him to the utmost extent. It is therefore all the more our unalterable will in this struggle to save our people from the most horrific fate of all time, to shrink from nothing and to obey steadfastly and faithfully the command to preserve our nation. The Almighty has created our people. By defending its existence, we are defending His work. Since this defense is inevitably associated with unspeakable misfortune, suffering, and pain, it only makes us cling to this people all the more. But it also allows us to gain the toughness necessary to fulfill our duty even at the most critical moments of crisis. That means not only our duty to decent eternal Germany, but also our duty toward those few dishonorable ones who separate themselves from their own people. Therefore, in this fateful struggle, there is only one commandment for us. Whoever fights for honor can thereby save life for themselves and their loved ones. But whoever cowardly or dishonorably betrays the nation will, under all circumstances, die a shameful death. That National Socialism was able to awaken and strengthen this spirit in our German people is its greatest achievement. When one day, after the end of this most tremendous world drama, the bells of peace ring out, only then will it be recognized what the German people owe to this spiritual rebirth. It is nothing less than its very existence in this world. Just a few months and weeks ago, the Allied statesmen openly described the German fate. They were then quite strongly admonished by some prominent newspapers to be considerably wiser and to rather promise something, even if there was absolutely no genuine intention of keeping that particular promise later on at any point in time. At this hour, as an unyielding National Socialist and fighter for my people, I would like to give these other statesmen, once and for all, the assurance that any attempt to influence National Socialist Germany through persuasion, coercion, or disintegration presupposes a naivety that today's Germany does not possess. But it is not at all truly decisive that in the modern democracies, political activity and outright lies appear as inextricably inseparable allies. What is truly decisive is that every single promise these influential statesmen make to a trusting people is now completely and utterly meaningless, because they themselves are no longer in a viable position to genuinely fulfill any such solemn assurance. It is no different than if a vulnerable sheep were to confidently assure another that it could effectively protect it from a ferocious tiger. In contrast, I repeat my prophecy. England will not only be utterly unable to convert Bolshevism, but its own internal development will inevitably proceed more and more in the direction of this deeply disintegrating and destructive disease. The spirits that the democracies have summoned from the steppes of Asia will no longer be able to be banished by them. All the small European nations that surrendered in reliance on Allied assurances are heading toward their complete annihilation. Whether this fate befalls them a little sooner or later is utterly irrelevant, given its inevitability. It is solely tactical considerations that move the committee Jews to proceed at times immediately with brutality, and in other cases at first somewhat more cautiously. The end will always be the same, but Germany will never suffer this fate. The guarantee for this is the victory achieved 12 years ago within our country. Whatever our opponents may devise, whatever suffering they may inflict on our lands, and above all on our people, it pales in comparison to the irreparable misery and misfortune that would befall us if ever the plutocratic conservative conspiracy were to prevail. It is therefore all the more necessary, on the 12th anniversary of the assumption of power, to strengthen our hearts more than ever before, and finally to reinforce the sacred resolve to bear arms, no matter where and no matter under what circumstances, until in the end, victory crowns our efforts. But on this day, I also want to leave no doubt about something else. In defiance of an entire hostile world, I chose my path inwardly and walked it as an unknown, nameless man until ultimate success. Often declared to be dead and always wished to be dead, yet in the end, I have emerged victorious. But my life today is likewise determined solely by the duties that are incumbent upon me. Summed up, they amount to only one thing: to work for my people and to fight for them. Only the one who called me to this duty can release me from it. It was in the hands of Providence on July 20th, through the bomb that exploded 1.5 meters from me, to wipe me out and thus end my life's work. That the Almighty protected me on that day, I see as a reaffirmation of the mission entrusted to me. Therefore, in the coming years as well, I will continue on this path of uncompromising advocacy for the interests of my people, undeterred by any hardship or danger, and filled with the sacred conviction that, in the end, the Almighty will not abandon the one who, throughout his life, wanted nothing more than to save his people from a fate that, by neither their numbers nor their significance, have they ever deserved. Therefore, at this hour, I appeal to the entire German people, above all to my old comrades in arms and to all soldiers, to arm themselves with an even greater, harder spirit of resistance until we may once again, as we have before, lay the wreath with its ribbon on the graves of those who have fallen in this mighty struggle and say, "Yet you have triumphed." I expect every German, therefore, to fulfill his duty to the utmost, to accept every sacrifice that is demanded of him and must be demanded. I expect every able-bodied person to commit himself, body and soul, to the fight. I expect every sick, infirm, or otherwise indispensable person to work to the very limit of his strength. I expect the inhabitants of the cities to forge the weapons for this fight, and I expect the farmers, through the greatest possible personal sacrifice, to provide the bread for the soldiers and workers of this struggle. I expect all women and girls to support this fight with the utmost fanaticism, just as they have done up to now. I address myself with special confidence to the German youth. By forming such a sworn community, we can rightfully stand before the Almighty and ask for His grace and His blessing. For a people can do no more than that everyone who can fight, fights, and everyone who can work, works, and all together make sacrifices, driven by the single thought of securing freedom, national honor, and thus the future of our lives. No matter how severe the crisis may be at this moment, in the end it will be overcome by our unyielding will, our willingness to make sacrifices, and our abilities. We will overcome this hardship as well. In this struggle, too, it will not be inner Asia that prevails, but Europe, and at the forefront, the nation that for 1,500 years has represented Europe as a leading power against the East, and will continue to do so in the future, our greater German Reich, the German nation.